Hey everyone, welcome. We are here for Writing Trans Romance, and we're going to begin in just a moment. But first, I want to quickly review our housekeeping rules. We ask that you please keep your mics off unless invited to speak, and your video is welcome to be on, but it will be hidden if they become distracting. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat throughout the event, and I'll be sure to share those with our hosts at the end during our Q&A. And today's event is hosted by Kewpie, they, them pronouns, and Nova, they, he pronouns. Kewpie, a non-binary artist, is a writer and comic creator focused on making inclusive art of diverse identities and queer and BIPOC inclusive education, and has been volunteering and leading in local spaces centered on building community for over a decade. Nova is a trans-masculine artist who enjoys writing trans characters and fan fiction. They've hosted educational presentations over artist techniques, as well as spoken about their trans experience in various interviews. Their original works focus on trans euphoria and desire. And I'll be in the background if you need any assistance, and take it away.
Thank you for that, Jesse. I'll have QP take the floor with. I forgot that we were doing little bios, so we also wrote our own to include.
Okay, so hi, I'm QP. I'm a non-binary artist who writes and draws marginalized groups, including queer characters. I'm currently writing a web comic centered around a trans man who is in a relationship with an older bisexual cis man.
I'm MangoCryptid. I'm also a non-binary trans-masculine artist who enjoys creating art and comics centered around queer joy, romance, and whimsy. And most of the characters I create are queer in some sort of queer relationship.
My trans-related works include my comic that recently launched called Hot Pink Ego Death. It's on Comic Fury. I'm known for drawing trans original characters and non-original characters reimagined as trans. I've been featured in the November 2025 edition of Amplifying Trans Joy.
And I've created a one-shot comic, which is over here on the left, my very first comic ever. It's a T for T couple comic called Never Been Kissed. A lot of my art focuses on queer, trans, and gender nonconforming characters. Um, and I was also featured in the Amplifying Trans Joy newsletter for the March 2026 edition.
Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about before talking about writing trans characters in romance is learning how to write trans characters. Romance is best when it's written in between two fleshed out, nuanced individuals and not stereotypes and people who desire those stereotypes.
While there is no one perfect way to, write a trans character, hopefully some of these tips can help make the brainstorming feel a little less daunting in the long run.
Dysphoria is a big part of the transgender journey, but it doesn't have to be the only part. Their stories can also focus on gender euphoria as well.
Regardless if a character is trans or not, understand that at the end of the day, your character is an individual person and you can represent their own individual experiences. Don't try to write a catch all like good trans person, just focus on writing the person in trans person.
Just like in real life, being trans sometimes is the smallest part of the trans person's life. Well, it can be a core part of your character's identity. Understanding it doesn't have to be the only part of it. Think of it as like a couple of pieces to a much larger puzzle. It helps to complete the picture, but it's not the only thing that the picture entails. Okay, so stereotypes versus nuance. A stereotype is an oversimplified and often inaccurate mental image or generalization held about a particular group of people. When it comes to queer groups, especially trans peoples, stereotypes are often used in propaganda to erase, dismiss, or villainize trans people, leading to real world harm. It's important to remember that oppression can come in not only the form of discrimination, but also glorification, fetishization. While you may be thinking something is a positive representation, it could be feeding into stereotypes you are unaware of. Stereotypes uh, can't always be avoided, but they can be corrected with nuances and awareness.
Writing nuance with a trans character can be a lot like writing one for a cis character. Allow them to be flawed, much like QB mentioned a little bit earlier, or like your character doesn't have to be a good trans person or perfectly sanitary. You don't have to let their transness withhold them from being like complex and morally gray or contradictory. Trans characters are and deserve to be just as nuanced and flawed as their cis counterparts.
Okay, so for our stereotypes to avoid slide, unfortunately, much like in the real life, in the real world, a lot of these stereotypes towards trans people in media are focused on trans women. Um, so most of the ones that we list off have a strong trans female focus. Um, One of the most prolific stereotypes is the transsexual predator. When a trans person, typically a trans woman, is seen as preying on victims sexually, typically young girls. Often this paints trans people as a threat to normal people. There is a sister trope to this stereotype that is called the trans serial killer. Instead of explicit sexual harassment, it is aimed more towards more physical harm and murder. Both overlap and are used to justify banning harm are used to justify banning harm and harassment of trans people.
Another common trope seen in media, even though not always are the characters explicitly transgender, is the man in a dress trope, especially when the intent is to manipulate those around him. Typically, the man is dressing up as a caricature of a woman in order to achieve a goal that would better his life in the long run. This trope not only touches on, real world transphobia, but misogyny as well. In universe, it's used to make fun of masculine women, trans or not, and then in the real world, the phrase man in a dress is usually used as like a fear mongering term to paint trans women as predators towards young girls.
And a very similar but different trope is a man in a dress out of universe, which is basically when a character is a character that's meant to be seen as a cis woman in universe is played by a man out of universe. Um, uh, this often is used to make fun of the idea of a masculine woman. Um, while the characters themselves are not trans in the context of the story, the idea of a feminine person um, being born with masculine traits is undesirable and is worse than feminine women is a layered mix of misogyny, transphobia, and racism. While not exclusive to the Black community, it absolutely takes on a more problematic role when the character is Black due to stereotypes of Black women, especially dark skinned Black women, being masculinized and less desired. Also, this is my obligatory fuck Tyler Perry.
A common trope also seen in media is the quote unquote really a man punchline. The stereotype is often seen when typically a trans woman kisses or sleeps with a man, and then it's revealed in this big grand gesture that the man was really a woman he had relations. That the woman he had a relationship with was really a man after all. It usually ties into other characters calling him gay. Not only is this trope demeaning to trans women due to invalidating their gender, but if it paints them as a type of freak. Also touching on upon like the what QP said earlier about it going against quote unquote normal people. This unfortunately ties into real world where cis people often have this reaction to discovering that someone they're involved with is transgender. Well, in media, the scene usually ends after the reveal, and the trans character is the butt of the joke. Real life consequences are a lot more dire and shouldn't be normalized even on screen. On the other side of the same coin, though, is the man is actually a girl trope, but the character hardly faces any repercussions in the long run and is normally just doing it due to a gender restriction, not manipulation.
Any stereotypes that exist to do with trans men all kind of fall under the same general label of trans men aren't real men. This manifests in different ways in media. Typically, the trans guy wants to be a girl after all, or infantilizing trans men. While some trans men can absolutely present feminine and with soft personalities, that's a personality choice. Trans men can't tend to not to be able to escape stereotypes that are often projected onto them because of misogynistic perceptions.
There are a few notable negative trans stereotypes that target trans men specifically because the scope of trans male representation in mainstream media is already really limited. But while researching all of this, we are very thankful that overall transgender representation on TV screens, and comics, and media are mostly positive and only seem to be getting better as the years pass, as transgender people and characters become a larger discussion in mainstream media and society.
Time to get into the good representation. Um, The first picture is of Rain Whispers from the Owl House. Rain Whispers from the Owl House is a non-binary character. They are a great example of trans characters because their focus in the story is not on gender. In fact, they are completely socially transitioned older trans person, and their identity is accepted in society. Throughout the story, they are allowed to have nuanced perspectives about the world and dynamic relationships with the characters. You understand how their identity influences their decisions in the show without being the entire center of their character.
I wanted to highlight Electra Abundance from Pose. She's a trans woman who's also played by a trans actress. If anyone's ever seen Pose, it definitely shines in its queer person of color representation through its characters and storylines and casting. I wanted to specifically highlight her from the show rather than another character because I think she's not only a very well written character, but a very layered one as well. She has a bold personality, views herself very highly to the point where it can kind of come off as pompous and selfish. She refuses to be vulnerable and can be extremely harsh to those around her, such as other characters or her daughters. However, it doesn't mean that she's completely irredeemable. She's a character that deals with her own struggles of dysphoria and having to trade financial stability to transition and her own insecurities around her need for validation. She's able to show grace and love towards the people in her inner circle. And no matter where you are or what room you're in, like the name of Electra Abundance. Her transness isn't the only part of her story, it's not the whole piece. And there's just so much to her as a character.
And then the next character I wanted to talk about is Barney from Dead End. Barney is a trans man who is good trans rep because the story allows him to be a character with interests, hobbies, and motivations, and conflicts both related to and not related to him being trans. It's made clear that transphobic characters are the ones who are the problem, not him for being trans. He is completely able to be out and be in a space that fills him with joy. It's not his responsibility to make people accept him. Though he is a teenager who is growing and changing and is unsure about the world around him, he never questions his identity, and he knows it's not a phase, even when he's unsure about everything else.
The last character we wanted to highlight for this slide is Nao Iwakura. She's a trans woman from the anime Skip to Loafer. Well, she is a minor character compared to the other characters on this slide. Her impact is nonetheless felt by the characters. She's a very supportive figure to the main character Mitsumi, often giving her life advice throughout the show and the manga. She's very fashionable, very confident in herself and her identity, but still struggles with insecurities and dysphoria. Um, in the manga series, she's even shown in a supportive romantic relationship with someone who's not only understanding of her gender identity, but of the little stuff of her character as well, showing that he pays attention to her and her needs.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about writing trans characters and relationships. We're going to discuss the differences between writing T for T and T for C relationships. T for T stands for trans, and T for C stands for trans for cis. Oh, I thought you were going to read the other bullet points.
Oh, sorry, that was my bad. I apologize.
No, you're good. Um, much like with writing trans characters, allow them to be complex and nuanced. Um, sorry, that's yours.
If their transness is a discussion in a relationship, something that you can touch upon is how their partner supports them, usually with like social support such as um, correcting name and pronouns, everyday support such as like helping medical transition or creating a safe environment for them, or emotional support such as when they're dealing with dysphoria or maybe there's discrimination that was involved, like how they are able to support them through that.
Okay, so trans relationships, they can bond over solidarity and connect to each other intimately because of their unique experience being trans. And they can discuss their differences with their transness. For example, if you have a couple that is um, a trans man and like a trans woman, they can both understand that they have a unique experience with being trans, but they also experience the world differently.
And then for a trans for cis relationship or T for C, you can discuss allyship and support, um, maybe helping them navigating through society and the world together, or discovering how to support their trans partner in real time. Because sometimes a character is the first trans person a cis character is dating, and maybe they're learning along with the trans person of how they need to have their needs accommodated or what support they need. Um, Obviously, if you're writing this, be cautious of fetishization. Um, an example of this could be a cis partner only wanting to keep their trans partner a secret sexual fantasy rather than being like a public romantic partner that they're proud of. This kind of leads into like a transphobe turned romantic partner, believing that suddenly they're not transphobic anymore just because they're dating a trans person. The two often kind of overlap like a Venn diagram. Um, if this is something that's touched upon, I would say tread lightly.
Yeah, that trope tends to be very akin to similar to if a person who is racist then suddenly dates a person of color, and then it's just like, oh, well, now I see, you know, trans people as like people. It's just like it's a very slippery slope when you do that trope. Okay, so for good representations, make sure that you are showing them be supportive of their trans partners and learning ways to be there for them. We kind of touched on this in like the last slide. There are like many ways to support the partner and make sure that they're actively learning about being a supportive partner.
Another good sign that like what you're seeing and what you're writing is going to be a good relationship is having a fleshed out relationship. You don't want to build them up and then when they finally get together just to be pushed to the background, or that their relationship is implied but never shown. You want to give them that space to explore their dynamic just like you would like a cis for cis couple.
Yeah, and then really good thing that's not just about writing trans romance, but romance as a whole is healthy communication. Like have your characters like actually talk to each other about their struggles and issues and boundaries and things like that. Actually have them have conversations instead of it kind of just being like, oh, we love each other and that's it. That's the entire end of their story together. Have them actually talk about the things and their identities. And then for complicated relationships, um, we already briefly talked about the reformed transphobe trope, which is incredibly common. It is where a character will be just so adamantly transphobic, and then they're attracted to a trans person, and all of a sudden there's like, well, now that I'm sexually attracted to you, all of a sudden I'm totally not transphobic, and it's just completely fine. Yeah, like trans people don't want to date transphobes. It's icky, it's gross, and it's just a very common trope. You're really good. You're going to be better off avoiding it.
I think something that kind of like ties into that as well is the denial of gender identity. Often, the cis character will be shown to be in denial of the trans character's identity. And then they feel like this internal struggle, like if they acknowledge and accept it, then that this might make them gay or confront things that they're not ready to. And it becomes this, again, icky territory of, like with the last one, of just not allowing a trans person to be loved and respected and have a partner that loves and respects them. And the two just kind of tie in together, um, usually within the same storyline.
Yeah. And then there's also an unfortunately really common trope of the stepping stone for a cis relationship. It is when a character like will date a trans person um, briefly, and then but at the end, like trans people aren't like the end goal relationship. They're just kind of like an experiment, like a thing to do instead of like, like a serious, intimate relationship with a partner. It's kind of just like, oh, you go off and you date a trans person for a little bit, but in the end, you're always going to end up with a cis person.
And then, kind of once again, briefly mentioned on the last slide is not showing the relationship. Um, Sometimes, again, they're delegated to a background character, or even just a background image. Maybe they're even built up to have this relationship, but then once they say like the I do's or the I want to be your boyfriend or girlfriend, like then that's the end of their story when it feels like that should just be the beginning of it. Like this was the prologue and now this is what the meat and potatoes of it should be, but it often gets shut out and not shown at all.
Okay, tips and tricks. Obviously, one of the biggest tips that we can give to you is to consume media by trans people. If you want to learn about trans experiences, the best people to ask is trans people. And trans people are always writing about our experiences in different ways, and we are always making things that you can consume.
And it's, if you can write a trans character, if you can write a character, you can almost most definitely write a trans character. I know that a lot of people may get a little anxious about making sure they're doing it right, but there is no right way to be trans. It's not easily defined. While there is things that you can, like harmful stereotypes that you can avoid, like we mentioned earlier, a trans experience is always someone's individual experience. For example, a queer trans person is going to have a different experience in life than a straight trans person. So even though they're both trans, their sexualities are different. They may present differently. So they may be going through the world in different paths. So there's ways that you can have nuance and complexity with it and not it be one cookie cutter shape.
Also, very big thing, do not have a character's gender be revealed by investigating the gender of the character. This is unfortunately so common. It is, at minimum, incredibly rude and intrusive, and at worst, it is just straight up sexual harassment. Do not have a character's gender be revealed by another character investigating them. It's just genuinely triggering and kind of just bad all around.
And then if you're writing a trans character or a trans romance story and you're still unsure, you can always ask a trans person. There's a lot of forums online that you can go to and ask for. I was told by Kewpie that there was a section specifically in the cartoonist, the Discord, to ask for advice. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who would be willing to give some 2 cents on that. And if you have trans peers in your circle, you can always see if they would be willing to read over what you have and take notes.
Okay, this is a slide where we get to talk about our trans characters. So the first picture is the picture of my couple who is Jules and Vincent. They are from my comic, and I like them a lot. Jules is the blonde one. He is a trans man, and I absolutely love writing him, and I love his relationship with Vincent a lot. I One of my favorite things about writing Jules is that he is a very feminine trans man, and I get to explore parts of gender that I don't really get to always express myself. I very much relate to feminine trans man in fiction often, and I get to kind of explore gender through him and him being able to be out of the closet and be like, his authentic self. But I also get to explore the dynamics of him being a trans person in a relationship with um, Vincent, who has like never actually dated a man before, and kind of like exploring like the nuances of like a new queer relationship, and the two of them kind of learning how to navigate that together, and also just like the the nuances of being a younger trans person, kind of being in your first stable relationship, which comes with Vincent kind of like being older and like more stable and very different, and being in a very different environment than what Jules is used to. And I love exploring them.
And then right below Cupie's characters are my characters, Happy and Licorice. They're the main characters to my comic that I made, Mother and Kiss. They're a T for T couple. They both explore their gender identity and presentation through J fashion. Um, Not only for my own love of J fashion, I wanted to have these characters, but being able to explore yourself and your identity and presentation and your aesthetics, like through that, and not only being able to do that individually, but together. It starts out like their story starts out as just, a trans girl's crush on this cute trans boy she sees at a fashion beat, and then it becomes something so much bigger for both of them. And being able to explore, trans euphoria and whimsy and, gender nonconformity through them both, it's done a lot for me.
And then next we have our shared characters, who are Eon and Jordan. Eon is the pink haired character. Eon uses he, they pronouns and is gender fluid. And Jordan uses he, him pronouns. Um, and he's that's a cis guy. And these are like OCs that we like writing together. I made Jordan, Nova made Eon, and I love writing for them. I love exploring their dynamics together, especially because they're not really a standard couple. They're not so much like, oh, we're so lovey-dovey and cute together. They have like a very specific dynamic, uh, because a lot of their relationship starts through kink, and then they get to kind of like learn more about each other, and kind of like Jordan is a character who is healing through trauma and recovering from a queer relationship that was kind of like very public and also very messy. So this is like, like his next relationship directly after that. And he's exploring just like the dynamics of that, and also being into someone who isn't exactly like monogamous or like super affectionate, which I mean helps because neither is he. And just kind of like how they heal each other and how they play with their dynamics of their personality.
And then to touch on that too, specifically with Elon's gender identity and how that plays. Um, he is a gender fluid character that still identifies, as a feminine man, and he does a lot of exploration of gender outside of, what is like what binary we have. He's very confident in himself and his identity, and I feel like a lot of his confidence is what kind of rubs off on Jordan a little bit and helps them be able to have these tougher conversations and these dynamics and just being able to work together.
Okay, so in conclusion, be mindful of stereotypes when you're writing trans characters, and remember that even like when you can't wholly avoid a stereotype, try to add more nuances and greater perceptions to that stereotype, and avoid the things that make them inherently harmful.
And then to focus on their individual traits and flaws. It's okay to make them complex and nuanced. And in fact, we encourage them to be complex and nuanced. They deserve to have the same depth that you would see with any other character in fiction.
Allow them to experience joy and euphoria. So many stories about trans people tend to only focus on the dysphoria and like the negative parts of being trans. And it's one of those things where like there is genuinely so much joy that comes with being trans. And also it's one of those things where not even every trans person experiences dysphoria. So like focusing way more on the joy and euphoria is like really, it's a great way to write good trans characters.
And and make sure that you can give them meaningful and fulfilling relationships. You can have messy ones, you can have chaotic ones, but at the end of the day, like make sure that this works for them and that this isn't just another chaotic mess for them to experience. But they should experience again joy and euphoria even through relationships and how that can make them learn about themselves.
And most importantly,
Have fun. Because at the end of the day, that's what characters are. Characters are fun. They're little blorbos in your head that you get to share with the world. And so if you're not having fun, then what's the point of it?
right, Q&A time.
Yeah, that was awesome, you two.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I don't have any questions for y'all in the chat just yet, but while we give folks a time to think about that and type up their comments, I'm curious if y'all could talk more about your experience creating your characters together.
Nova, do you want to go first on that?
Oh yeah, I can go first.
Yeah.
As like us individually making characters, or the ones specifically that we share.
I guess I'm thinking more about like how it feels to work with another trans creator creating characters that interact together, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
understand you. It's very fun. It's very nice. For so long, I'm in the rural South. There's not a lot of trans people that I've met. Definitely not ones that I could share characters with. And so being able to work with someone who not only wants both of us to have trans characters that experience joy and being complex and allowing them to not just be cookie cutter characters is very fun. I like being able to explore these dynamics because I put a lot of myself into my characters, especially with my more trans characters and the ones that don't exactly fit a binary. And so being able to create with someone who also doesn't fit a binary and us having that mutual understanding with our characters, I think um, make is very comforting experience because it definitely makes you feel less alone in the process. Um, because I can think about my OCs all day alone, which is fine, and I do it all the time anyway. But there's something more special about being able to share that with someone and for us to build this world together where everyone interacts and they're able to live their lives freely.
Love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and the reason I had Nova go first is because I think that most of the trans characters that we have in common, Nova made first, and then I was just like, I like this character also. Let's put our characters together, because that's definitely what happened with Ian and Jordan, who are like our main OCs that we like share together. Is that Nova made Ian, and I was like, wow, I'm like obsessed with this OC. And then I made Jordan, and then I was like, I think they should kiss. And now it's been like 2 or 3 years of that. And it's one of those things where we have like a special connection, like obviously not only just like being best friends for 7 years, but also just like we're both like, like AFAB non-binary people who do like present like more feminine and like to kind of just like be like more gender fuck and like play around with our gender and stuff. Like we can have characters who are masculine and also just really like to wear bright pink and rainbow and everything. We have very similar aesthetics and very similar personalities. So it's one of those things like it comes out in our characters. And it's one of those things where we also get to explore like 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 how would this character talk about like their dysphoria, or how would like this character go about like being out to their family, like and kind of just like get to talk about like different dynamics that may or may not be true for us as trans people, but then like we get to explore them like through our OCs and through stories.
I love that so much. And I relate to a lot of that, but I also want to not focus on my relating to that and share the questions that we have in the chat. We have one that says, what are your thoughts on marketing stories as having trans characters? In some ways, it feels awkward to dig that deep, but also it feels like a way to attract an audience that supports trans people and characters.
That's a good question. I think that like the both of us are kind of just like, yeah, come look at the trans characters, kiss other trans characters. Because just I think like as queer people, I think like we're always looking for other queer like art. So like I guess like when you're queer and you didn't grow up with a bunch of like queer stuff, like whenever you see another queer person making stuff, you're just like, yeah, like I think it's just I wouldn't be afraid to be like, look at this trans character. I guess as long as you're not doing it in like a weird way, like just yeah, like be like, especially right now because it's Pride Month, like be totally comfortable with just being like, yeah, my story has like a main trans OC. My story has like like it's gay, like this has lesbians or as a trans woman or non-binary character. Like, I would just say like anything that would probably make you psych yourself out, just know that like gay people love gay people. like we're gonna show up. It's not and once again, as long as you're not being weird about it and like a more like say that you're not trans yourself, and like you're like the only thing you say about your story is that there's a trans character and you don't add any more information about them. Other than that, I really just think like, yeah, go out, just be like, yeah, trans, and I guarantee you, a bunch of trans people will show up like in herds. They'll be like, yeah, trans.
I kind of also agree. I think even whenever you're just marketing like oh like this story has trans characters, like a lot of people are looking for that. I know I specifically love to look for things that are marketed as having non-binary and trans mass characters. But people do this for every identity and trope. Like if it's an enemies to lovers, they're promoting that it's enemies to lovers. If there is a black woman of color as a main lead, they're going to be promoting that. So I feel like it's the same thing as you were just promoting like what you have written. I don't think there's anything like cringe or awkward about it. In fact, I get more excited being like, oh, this is what this has in it, because I know what I'm going into. I definitely think that like whatever the cop in your head is saying is just making it a lot more awkward than it actually is. I think people celebrate like what you could market for it more than you think. And I think especially now, a time where like trans art and trans people are being censored, like being able to be openly like, I have created this trans piece of art or this writing, and I really want you to know that like this is what this is. I think that's kind of its like own powerful statement in a way. So I wouldn't be so like scared to do it. I think it would help you more in the long run. Like I said, like QB said, as long as it's not like kind of coming off as like a chaser way.
I would also just want to add that like one of the universal experiences that I found like with other trans people is that when we, were first like discovering our gender and such, is that we would basically just Google any piece of media that has like the identity that we think we are. Like the universal experiences I've had with like other trans people where it's just like looking up every single piece of media that has like a trans man in it and being like the same five pieces of media. Like I guarantee you that like honestly promoting that that's there is like exactly what a random teenager is looking for right now, and they're going to remember like this random thing that you made for the rest of their life because it was a part of essentially that journey for them.
Yeah, with my experience, like the first trans manga I ever found that I loved down to death, even though it ended terribly, was Wandering. Like the representation is not great, especially by today's standards. But it was the first piece of media that someone from me from the rural South ever got to see, and it was so euphoric and like just I felt a connection to it because I was the same age as these characters when I found this. I found this character that's trans mask, and like they're experiencing the same things that I'm experiencing and trying to figure that out. And so even if you're like, oh, my representation isn't amazing, like I don't know if anyone will read this, representation is representation at the end of the day, and it can mean the world to someone, even if you don't think it will in the long run.
Did we name it? Should we name the manga?
Oh, I named the manga. I said it was Wandering Sun.
Oh yeah, with
Wandering
Wandering Sun, we
Sun.
both ready.
That actually brings us to our next question. This person joined a little bit late. They're at work, but after reviewing the slides, they're curious about any specific tropes specifically that can be read or interpreted incorrectly or might just unintentionally be seen in a bad way.
Um, hmm. Tropes specifically. I mean, I guess outside of like this, because we listed off the stereotypes. I think tropes, like, because stereotypes and tropes are different. I think like stereotypes are the thing that's like, more implicitly harmful to groups. Whereas like tropes are kind of like their their own ball game. Like, because tropes are kind of one of those things that are more neutral because they're kind of just a set of like repeating things in media. Um, I can't think of like any tropes that would like relating to trans people like outside of stereotypes that would be an issue. I think really my big one is just that like how many tropes are just the teenage really just teenage trans people. This is I understand. I'm not saying don't write teenage trans people, but I would love to see a trans character over the age of 30, especially because of how many of us have like a shorter life expectancy. It'd be great to just see like old trans people. That's a trope that I would love to see subverted. Also, just like when characters are like going through like their like egg cracking uh thing. Like I watched a lot of Degrassi growing up. Y'all are about to realize that so fast. Like it's like kind of like this really big dramatic thing, and not that that's not something that happens in real life, but the amount of times, especially as like a teenager, where I did have other trans kids like come up to me and be like, "Hey, I don't think I'm straight." It's just like, yeah. It's like, you think I could be trans? I'm like, maybe. You kind of get vibes. And that's just it. I want so bad to see like casual egg cracking instead of it always being treated as like a character feels like they're gonna die.
We
Oh, egg
actually have
cracking is
somebody,
a
yeah.
term that refers to when a character is finding out that they're trans.
We have another question that says, I'm currently writing an autobio piece that explores issues associated with gender and identity, and I worry about misrepresentation based on the lens of what is shared because of being in an environment of aggressive sexism, especially since the piece has to do with sex workers. I worry about being offensive because of some of the assumptions made in the environment and the limitations of the narrator and the assumptions being made just getting into sex work and assumptions of gender, as I want to target authenticity of the story, but there's a lot going on when it comes to assumptions made by others, the narrator, and so
Ask trans people.
on.
I think also with it being an autobiographical piece, there's a lot that's going to be in your life and what seems like your experience that if it was like written with just a completely fictional character, like people could be like, oh, this is very offensive. But with it being your own experience, I think you have slightly more leeway than you think. Obviously, if there's going to be a lot of terms that might be slurs or very derogatory or things that might be very triggering, that could be something you could discuss and definitely warn readers ahead of time. But sometimes, in life, you're going to experience these awful terms and things, and if you're writing from your experience, and it being an autobiographical piece, um, I think you don't really have to worry about misrepresentation because it's your experience. But I do understand the anxiety of just wanting to make sure it's not um, just like or um, that it's not going to be seen as harmful.
Also, to elaborate on my ask trans people thing, like obviously getting like trans sensitivity readers is really good. But also God, I lost a thought. Um, yeah, getting trans sensitivity readers is really good, but also just kind of know that inherently, when it comes to sex work, like sex work is unfortunately really controversial. I don't think it should be. It's like one of those things where like you can ask for advice, but also be aware that like because having characters, especially trans characters that are like sex workers, can sometimes be seen as like a trope in itself. Even though I do think that it is once again difference between stereotypes and tropes. There's nothing wrong with like a trans person being a sex worker. There's also genuine, real queer history of that. And so it's like one of those things where get sensitivity readers, listen to other people and like nuance things, but also understand that like you can't really please everybody. Oh my god, the loudest mower just went by. You can't please everybody. But also sometimes that's the point of writing a thing. And I think writing anything with sex workers or really sex in general isn't about pleasing everybody.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot to be said about respectability politics as well, when it comes to this kind of thing. And I would also encourage you to work with people who are trans who are also sex workers too, if you're ever curious about getting a more expansive look at your work as well. That person who replied, sorry, asked the question, replied, "Thank you. Yeah, trans sensitivity readers sound great, as I definitely am familiar with tropes and can't dance away from it based on the nature of it being an autobiography."
Trans sensitivity readers don't have to be just for cis writers. It can also be, yourself, because sometimes whenever you're writing, you might get in your own head about it or in your own bubble, and just regardless for any writing too, just having a second pair of eyes is always going to be useful. Um, so I think that would definitely help you with that.
Yeah.
And we also have another question that says, "I'm a new comic creator. As a comic creator, what advice do you want to give to someone who wants to get better?"
Hold on. You answer because of the mower.
Yeah, I would say do the thing. I am also a newcomer in comics specifically. I've been creating stories and artwork, but I've never put it to comics until this year. And I always psyched myself out. Um, but sometimes you just got to do the thing. And it's best to start small. Don't try to plan a like multi-year project as your first project. This is advice that Cupie gave me actually. I'm just reiterating it, especially because they're having the motor issue thingy. But start small with like a even just a 5-page comic or a 10-page comic. Like just keep it small. And if you just keep doing these small things, it's going to learn how to be easier to do the bigger projects that you want to do. That like you don't have to stop wanting to make the big projects, but it's easier for you to start small and then go from there. I want to make more trans comics. I want to eventually make a long-term trans comic like QP is working on, the Copy Ego Dev. I want to do that, but I also understand that if I start with this big thing without chipping away at smaller projects first, I'm going to get burnt out and I'm going to get overwhelmed. But just doing these smaller projects and smaller stories or smaller instances of these characters' larger stories can also help your bigger story. Like um, specifically with my comic, it takes place during one date that these characters have, but it also will tie into larger story elements and their dynamic. And so you can just work small and then gradually grow bigger. I think that will help make it seem less daunting. Um, but yeah, my advice is do the thing.
Yes,
Now
do
that the
the
mower
thing.
is gone, I can answer that question also. I heavily advise um like building up resources. Please read Scott McCloud books. I don't know why I took so many years to do that. It answered basically every question I had ever asked anybody related to comics. Um, and also, I think the biggest advice I would give to anyone starting writing comics, especially like queer comics or whatever, is kind of just like forget every single thing that you know or what you think a comic should be. That is the first step to being a comic creator is to just forget comics, all of it. Because there is, from speaking from personal experience, there's a very big idea of what you think comics should be in your head. Kill that. The best thing you can do for yourself is kill the idea you have of comics in your head. I grew up reading DC and Marvel and like Hellboy and stuff. That kill that in your head. Those are great. Those are amazing. There is entire teams and decades and legacies and everything behind that. Now, once you kill that, go to your local like comic shop and find indie art. Go to Tumblr and find people making like comics in 24 hours. Read nothing but indie comics and reconstruct the idea of comics in your head. But the first thing you have to do is kill the original idea you have of comics. That is the best advice I can give to you, especially queer comics. Like, you will absolutely change your life when you learn how to do that.
Hell yeah to indie comics. Honestly, that's what keeps me coming back to the comics forever. And then we have another comment from someone that says, I'd love to see what you both think about what subjects might be best left to trans creators to explore.
Um, Probably trans suffering. I guess just like as like a as because not only like a trans person, but just like a person of color, I think that when you're not that other people can't write suffering, it's just people just kind of seem to suck at writing suffering when they're not a part of that group. I say that's 10 times more as a black person. Like you can write it, but it tends to be so repetitive and be the same thing, and you kind of just end up making like the 10th slave movie that year. And you don't want to do that, and like I feel like that applies for like queer stuff, because a lot of the queer movies I grew up on were all just like sad and about like queer people dying, basically, so that you know, like non-queer people could be like, well, maybe if we like actually treated them like people, they wouldn't have died. And it's kind of just like, wow, that's not great. I don't love growing up on that. And like when queer people write like queer stuff, we're like, ah, I kind of like really like going to like this kink fest, or I really love like discovering myself through like this hobby or whatever. Like, we get to be like humanized. So I think like when it comes to suffering specifically, just really when it comes to like marginalized groups, like uh, I would just prefer that marginalized groups write their own suffering, because we got enough of that. We got enough of non marginalized people writing marginalized suffering.
think I might have to agree um, with that statement. I was trying to think if there was a different one, but my mind just kind of went back to the same thing. Like, again, while I don't think it's impossible for someone who isn't trans to write trans suffering, it's just what we have so far for examples. Just feels like a lot of trauma porn for cis audiences. Um, and I think that, especially with a lot of the suffering and dysphoria that can come with being trans, it does feel a lot more layered than I think cis audiences realize. Like, because we'll hear people be like, "Oh, well, they didn't use your name and pronouns. Like, that must be so hard." Like, they chalk it up to that, or just being like, "Oh, I wish I was this gender," when it can feel so much more visceral than that. If you experience dysphoria, and again, like Kewpie mentioned, like a lot of stories where the trans person just ends up dying because they didn't know what else to do with the character. Because once they're happy, it's like, well, then what problems do they have? It's like, well, no, they can be happy now. That's the reward. Um, so I think if you aren't trans and you're trying to write that, I would definitely do your research and be cautious. I think that's where the trans sensitivity readers could come in. Um, but yeah, I think that's one that might just have to tread lightly.
Oh, and don't do autobiographies of dead trans people. Oh, for the love of God, don't do that. Um, the movie Boys Don't Cry. If you are unfamiliar with that and unfamiliar on why that is a mess of like trans representation, I would implore all of you to look into that. That is loaded.
Definitely heed the trigger warnings though.
Oh, huge trigger warnings. Oh my God, yeah. Trigger warning for Boys Don't Cry is sexual assault, transphobia, trans abuse. It is about like a real trans man who was killed. Um, and that movie is not the greatest representation of that story and how that was executed.
We have a question that says, how do you find sensitivity readers?
Um, really
Kind of
just,
like,
oh,
oh,
sorry, you go. You go.
I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of forums online. The first one I could think of, which may not always be the best, I will heed that, is, there's subreddits like r/ask transgender, but there are specifically trans-centered forums. I believe one I saw was Transgender Pulse. They have forums, and I saw forum posts of people specifically asking about how to write trans characters on there. And then, talking to your community, whether it be online or locally. Um, I think that could be a good avenue for that as well. Sometimes I have seen some trans people even offer services online of being a trans sensitivity reader. So you could see if you could find those and look into those avenues.
Yeah, I would also just be like, yeah, just ask us. Like if you know a trans person, like if you're like friends with someone, just like feel free to like ask them. Also like if you could just post on like Blue Sky or in like the co-op, or just in anywhere, just be like, hey, can like a trans person read this? Really just like the more trans people you know, the more people you have to ask. Like there are lots of people who I know who I could be like, hey, can you read this real quick? And like check over it and like whatever. It's kind of just about like building community. The more people that you're in community with, the more people you have to ask about things.
Completely agree. And we also have a note in the chat saying, join the co-op, which I agree with. That is also a great place to find people.
This is our
um,
Victoria join the co-op propaganda post.
yes. That's what all of our events for. um, I do know that there are places like readsy where you can find sensitivity readers. I haven't really looked on there for quite a while, so I'm not sure if it's still up to date. But there are websites like that. If you look for things like editors specifically, you can find them usually offering sensitivity reading as well. And then I have a question for you too. What advice would you have for folks who think that they are cisgender and then perhaps start writing a trans character and then think, huh, this actually sounds kind of close to home and pretty familiar. Maybe I'm trans. What do you think about that?
Welcome to the club.
Right?
I definitely feel like a lot of us discovered that through that same avenue. I think it can
Exactly the same.
like it can be very healing to do it like that. You could also document that as its own journey if you want. Like you never know if you might come back to that to make a comic one day, or even if it's just to journal for yourself of like what it's like to discover your gender identity through art and creating OCs. I think it could be a very fun, you know, intuitive thing to try.
So we've mentioned that we've been writing trans characters uh for over a decade, and the other day when we were talking about this, our both of our first experience with writing trans characters was us before we realized we were trans, and then like role playing trans characters, and then very quickly being like, wow, and just going down that rabbit hole.
So I love that. And I also want to share again the playlist for the NIF 2026 events that is in the chat. And for anybody watching this recording, if you're already on YouTube, then you're in the perfect spot. Just head over to that playlist tab and check out the NIF 2026 one. We have a wow, I lost the title already. Here it is. Representation through Trans Joy, which I think would be an excellent complimentary event to watch right after this one. So go ahead and check that out. Do we have any final chat questions or comments for our lovely hosts today? And also, we have several comments in the chat saying thank you both for your advice and for sharing this presentation. It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank
We're really
you.
happy to be here.
Yay. Yeah, this is really fun. I also still am in love with those slides. They're so freaking cute.
Thank you.
So someone says, great panel. Thanks for doing this. You all are fantastic. Thank you. Totally agree. Thank you both so much for doing this today. This was really fun.
Oh, I think that something that I think we wrote down, but may have not been a bullet point, is that we had mentioned like remember intersectionality. Oh yeah, because there was going to be a bigger statement I was going to say on that, where like for example, there's a difference in between like being like a black trans person and being like a white trans person. Like there's differences between like culture and class and race, and that like when you are writing a trans person, kind of be mindful of the ways in which those intersect, because it's very different being like a trans person in America versus like a trans person in like Africa. Like there's a lot of nuances to that, and that's something to always be mindful of. So like when you're writing a trans character, like are you writing a white trans character? Are you writing like, a black trans character? Like what time period do they exist in? How is that influencing them? And kind of just doing the research around that also.
Completely agree. Somebody mentioned cultural nuance, where it is taking place, and the cultural assumptions and nuance. Completely agree. And before we wrap up, I just want to mention we have our feedback survey in the chat if you don't mind filling that out. This really helps us make a lot of decisions about our upcoming events. So if you want to see more great ones like this, fill it out and let us know. If you're interested in hosting an event with us as well, you can definitely get in touch with us through there or emailing us at events@cartoonist.coop. And that applies to anybody in or out of the co-op. Although if you're not in the co-op, why not? Just come and join us. As you can see, it's really great here. All right. Looks like we are good to go for the day. Would you two like to share where folks can find you online?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, our next slide, real quick, if anyone wants to screenshot this, it's 3 comics made by trans creators and their trans stories. If anyone wants to check them out, they're all pretty great. I'll give it like a couple seconds for anyone to screenshot it if they want. You also have the link for the presentation if you want to look at it through there as well. But these pretty good stories.
Daybreak is so good.
It is very good. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Warning. Just wanted to make sure everyone could get it if they wanted. And then here is our links with the presentation. You'll also be able to click on them. We have KewpieArt's socials and my socials as well.
Check out those
And the
awesome
links to our
looking comics,
comics.
everybody.
Also, like when you're reading Nova's comic, remember that like this is like their first comic because it's like so good and so pretty. And I'm like, this is such an aesthetically pleasing first comic.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Definitely excited to check that out.
And when you read Cupid's comic, make sure to go spam those comments about how amazing it is. And tune
Oh,
in every week for a new page.
Yeah,
hell
the
yeah.
second page is being uploaded in a couple days. Eventually we will have like more than one. It literally just launched on Saturday. I mean Sunday. It updates on
Awesome.
Sundays.
Yay. Congrats, Cupid. That's awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that feels like an excellent place for us to end our presentation today. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. And thank you again to our amazing hosts for this wonderful presentation. If you are interested in joining us in the co-op, you can go to cartoonist.coop/join and come and talk to all our trans cool people in the co-op because we have a lot of us.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining and anybody who watches this on YouTube. We love you forever.
Thank you for
Yes.
watching.
Yay. Thanks, y'all. All right, I'm going to end the recording.